My name is Alicia Montgomery, and I'm a specialist at Stanford Libraries, and I'm also an urban ethnographer. On behalf of the program committee, welcome to Stanford and to the Community History Roundtable. The late great Black historian Vincent Harding reminds us in his book, Hope in History, that community history is a seedbed for creative transformations. He said, and I quote, "Beneath the layers of hurt, beneath the ragged laughter, we can hear within community history a willingness to endure. Endure and make music, metaphorically speaking, that wasn't there before. Music that carries a balm of healing, hope for this endangered planet. The children are waiting for the music. They are ready to sample it, to dance to it, to be inspired by it, to create their own new songs in the key of life," unquote. In that spirit, we're honored to welcome all of you, young and old, to today's event, in the hope that through the preservation and sharing of our community histories, we can find keys for the transformation of ourselves, our region, and our nation. I'd like to extend a special welcome to our history and community scholars who are sitting in the audience, students from colleges here in the Bay Area who are attending the conference due to their interest in learning and documenting community and public history. And I'd like to extend a special thank you to the staff from Event Services and Stanford Video and our catering and custodial staff for all the behind-the-scenes work that makes today's event possible. Okay. So if anybody here does tweeting, please use the hashtag #historyInCommunity. Now we're going to play a video land acknowledgement shared by members of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe of the San Francisco Bay Area.
Horshe Tuhi, Kanakraka. Good day, my name is Charlene Nijme, and I'm the chairwoman for the Muwekma Ohlone tribe of the San Francisco Bay Area. Here with me today, I have Vice Chair Monica Arellano and former Councilwoman Gloria Aliano, and Muwekma Youth, Isabella Gomez, Georgiana Gomez, Lucas Arellano, and Gabriel Nijme. Today, we will be reading our land acknowledgement on behalf of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. Thank you and welcome to our ancestral homeland.
Horshetuhi, Stanford University Tashu, Nuperote, Uyakish Ware, Aye Mani, Hiswe Ware, Buchun Tamien Wolwolam, Nonwente Muwekma.
Aye Muwekma Uyakish, Verona Ban, Alameda County Ta. Ne Shahishu Stekne, Tuhi, Muwekma Ohlone tribe, San Francisco Bay Area Tak. Nepe Ware, Oyo Wetel, Muwekma Wolwolam, as Verona Bantak, Suyakma.
Makintashu, Nupetita, Muwekmash, Wetel, Palo Alto Tak, Hemenia. Wayente at Oyo, Orto, Horshe Nepe Ware, Huyu, 1891.
Suyhanimu, Maknuma, Hemenia, Makin, Wayente, Ukshere, Hiti, Ayet, Dashu, Irite, Stanford University Tak, Achokmamu, Muwekma.
Palo Alto Tak, Hemenia, Tahe, Tashu Makware, Wolwolam, Mani Mak Heme, Mani Mak Ukshere, Mani Mak Tape. Tashu Muwekma Mak Isha, Mak Tuheste, Neshatuhi Rotenomo, Palo Alto Tak, Hemenia, Aye Bay Area Tak, Aho.
Now it's my pleasure to introduce Roberto G. Trujillo, Associate University Librarian for Special Collections.
Thank you, Alicia. Welcome, everybody. It's quite cool to see a crowd like this at this time of year, in spite of all the COVID problems that we've all been dealing with for the past several years. Anyway, welcome on behalf of the libraries and the Stanford Historical Society. We are grateful to our sponsors, including the Santa Clara County History Grant Program, the Stanford Historical Society, the Stanford Libraries, the Stanford Department of History, the Haas Center for Public Service, Land Buildings and Real Estate, and the Architectural Resources Group for offering the financial support that made this day possible. My task is to then introduce Al Camarillo, and that's going to be a little bit tricky because I've known Al for almost 50 years. I first met him when I was a librarian at the University of California in Santa Barbara, and his book had just been published by Harvard University Press that dealt with Mexicans in Santa Barbara and Southern California. And that book and that research over the years has been very important to me personally. I was at Santa Barbara for 7 years before coming to Stanford in 1982, so that means that I've been here almost 40 years. And through all of those 40 years, all of the community history that is at Stanford today is here in part because of Al Camarillo and Al's graduate students. Steve Pitti is here today as one of Al's students who used to work for me as a grad student. And I've received a number of Steve's students from Yale over the years who come to use the Stanford community history records that pertain to Mexicans in the U.S. The records at Stanford are probably the largest single archival collection that deals with Mexicans in the U.S. in any university system. It's probably close to 7,000 linear feet. It's several hundred individual collections. All of these collections are here in part because of Stanford's teaching and research programs. And we decide to acquire something with support from our faculty. And we collect for Stanford-centric teaching and research. And even though it's Stanford-centric, it means that because of who it is about and what it is about, it means that other people from other universities around the world actually come to Stanford because of them. And the number of dissertations that have been produced because of these community history records is phenomenal. And there are PhDs from probably all of the UC campuses, from Yale, from Harvard, from Texas, from New Mexico, all over the place, from Arizona. And it happens because of individuals, and it happens because of individuals like Al. He has probably written more letters of support for particular acquisitions over the past 40 years than he would want to remember. But the point is that he did, and he does, and he has always been one of the first people that I go to vet, should we get these particular papers from an individual, from an organization, what have you, be it political, be it historic, be it literary, be it photographers, be it medical, what have you. And so with that, this is the guy you're going to be hearing from in a few minutes, Al Camarillo, Professor Emeritus of History at Stanford. Al.
Thank you, Roberto. 50 years ago. We were only 12 back then, I want you to know. Welcome to you all. It's for me, and I'm sure for most of you, this is the first conference in a long, long time, so it's really nice to be back on the Stanford campus with a gathering, especially around the topic at hand for the next 2 days. I want to thank the Stanford Historical Society, Stanford University Archives with the Stanford Libraries, and all the programs and departments across campus that have helped fund this conference, Community and History. But a special thanks to Natalie Marine Street. Raise your hand, Natalie, where are you? She's out there working, and Josh Schneider, there they are. A special round of applause for them, because they are the two main organizers of this conference. They conceived of the conference to bring together university practitioners of public history, together with a variety of colleagues doing this important work in building community history in so many venues, both here and near and far. And I know very well how much time and effort and commitment goes into a conference like this. So again, thank you both for, this goes back now over, 2.5 years now at least in the original idea of this conference. So this plenary session is the kickoff for the theme of the day, day one of the two-day conference. Today, the preserving and telling the untold stories of Santa Clara County and beyond. And as I thought about what I might share with you in my opening comments for this plenary session, my mind wandered way back to 1975 when I started my career here at Stanford a long time ago. It would have been inconceivable for Stanford University in 1975 to sponsor a conference to discuss the importance of advancing understanding and appreciation of communities of color in public history. And if this was inconceivable for my generation of faculty of color, which was really the first cohort of faculty of color trained in United States higher education, it would have been virtually impossible for an earlier generation of advocates who came before us, who were pressing museums and historical societies at the local level, trying to persuade them to even give a modicum of recognition to the histories of their respective communities. Now, thanks to the efforts of those pioneers and hundreds, if not thousands, of others over the past half century to advocate for inclusion and representation, this conference and others like them could not have happened. And it's out of that advocacy for societal and institutional change and the building of bodies of knowledge about people forgotten in history that universities like Stanford, museums of history, community-based historical organizations can now do the work of telling the previously untold stories to which this conference sessions today are devoted. This work is ongoing, it's unfolding. And at the same time, this work is appreciated and moving forward in important ways. Good example, the number of people in this room today. It's a contested movement. It is negated, and we know from both recent and historical examples, the work that we value today and at these institutions is not supported. In fact, maybe even despised by large sectors of American society. But the strides made over the past 50 years in telling untold stories cannot be rolled back. The public history of communities of color genie can't be stuffed back into that bottle of neglect and ignorance, regardless of attempts to do so. This conference is a part of the ongoing movements to create a richer, more inclusive history for public consumption. The participants you will hear from shortly, part of that movement, and those in this conference session throughout the day are also part of that movement. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce you, the speakers for this plenary session, and I will introduce them in the order in which they will present. Susan Anderson is the History Curator and Program Manager at the California African American Museum located in Los Angeles. Through her writing, lectures, public history projects, and as a former director at the California Historical Society, interim chief curator for the African American Museum and Library at Oakland, and curator at UCLA Special Collections Library, Susan has given voice to California's hidden African American history. Susan's book, Nostalgia for a Trumpet, Poems of Memory and History, was published by Northwestern University Press. Susan's presentation, titled Adventures in Community History, is based on research for her book in progress entitled African Americans in the California Dream, to be published by Heyday Books. Her comments will focus on the value and shortcomings of community history practices, including archives, oral history, and public history projects, and why California history is incomplete and incoherent without understanding the impact of that Black Californians have had on transforming California's civic and public culture since 1850. Valentin Lopez is the chairman of the Aman Mutsun tribal band, one of 3 historic tribes that are recognized as Ohlone. The Aman Mutsun are comprised of the indigenous descendants forcibly taken to Mission San Juan Bautista in Santa Cruz. Chairman Lopez is also the president of the Aman Mutsun Land Trust, which was established in 2012. He is a Native American advisor to the University of California Office of the President on issues related to repatriation. He is also a Native American advisor to the National Alliance on Mental Health Illness and the Phoebe Hearst Museum of Anthropology. The Aman Mutsun are currently working to restore their traditional indigenous knowledge regarding land stewardship so they can return to the path of their ancestors. Chairman Lopez is working to restore the Matsun language as a traditional Matsun singer and dancer. And on an email, which I will share with you, that I had with Valentin, he shared a few sentences about the history of the people that resonated deeply with me. He said this: "The true history of California Indians has never been told. We have been ignored, forgotten, and erased from history. We experienced 3 periods of brutal colonizations, beginning with the Mission and Spanish era, followed by the Mexican era and the California American era. These 3 periods worked to destroy our culture, spirituality, indigenous environments, and so much more." In this talk, Valentin will briefly address 4 points: efforts to restore indigenous knowledge and environments, efforts to protect and conserve sacred cultural spaces, efforts to build a future for tribal members that remembers and honors their ancestors and fulfills their obligation to Creator. And lastly, efforts to promote healing from historic trauma. And our last speaker is Steve Pitty, who holds a special place in my heart because he's one of my former PhD students and one of my dear friends and a member of my familia. Steve Pitty is professor of history and American studies at Yale University. He is the founding director of Yale's Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration. An historian of Latinx communities in the 19th and 20th centuries, he is the author of The Devil in Silicon Valley and American Latinos and the Making of the United States. As a public historian, he has worked closely with the Smithsonian, has chaired the Scholars Council for Mexican American Civil Rights Institute in San Antonio, Texas, and has served as on the advisory board of the National Park Service. In that capacity, he chaired the National Historic Landmarks Committee and worked to broaden representation of and accurate depictions of the LGBTQ community, Asian Americans, Latinx, Native and Indigenous peoples, and African American past as well. His talk this morning, titled "Bringing Santa Clara County's Latinx History to Broad Publics," focuses on the challenges and opportunities facing those who seek to record, interpret, and share histories of the region over the last century. Urging special attention to the mid and late 20th century, he underscores the urgency of archival and oral historical work and of considering how local history speaks to larger developments in California and beyond. So thank you all 3 of our speakers for joining us this morning, and we'll start off with Susan Anderson.
What I'm going to do is borrow from my experience to share examples of some projects, public history and other projects that I've worked on. And I'm going to make a few provocative statements that I'm hoping we can follow up during Q&A, and I hope that's all right. I'm going to begin by saying that there's no such thing as community history, not really, that there are hierarchies of historical knowledge that have been imposed by professional historians, especially in the academy. In my view, it's either all history or it's all community history. By and large, what we call community history came about as a response to authoritarian approaches to the discipline of history that were exclusionary. And it encompasses attempts to provide a counter-narrative. But those of us who are practitioners know that it's much more than a response. And we are hoping to create new pathways into research and knowledge. If I wrote an essay called Coming to History, I begin with my own family, which you're looking at as an image taken in the 1950s of some of the elders in my maternal family. On the left and far left are one set of my great-grandparents. Far left, Bessie Harding Wilcox, and my great-grandmother, and Edward Wilcox, my great-grandfather, his brother and sister-in-law are sitting and standing next to them. And I include this because it's because of my own family that I got interested in asking questions that turned out to be historical in nature. I, like many of you, learned that African Americans came to California during World War II to work in the defense industry. And even as a little girl, that always struck me as wrong, because my mother's family began arriving in the Bay Area in the 1890s and established Bethlehem Lutheran Church in West Oakland in the 1920s. So I knew there was more to the story. So, as I said, I'm just going to share a bit about some of my projects, public history and research projects. This is and share some of the reflections and lessons I've learned. This is an image of the Heyer sisters, who were pioneering opera singers. Anna Maida and Emma Louise. They were born in 1855 and 1857 in Sacramento. One of the projects that initially, many years ago, starting in the 90s, to California's African American past, was studying Allensworth for a book I had hoped to write. And now Allensworth, the town, is a state historic park, was established by a distinguished group of Black men in Los Angeles in 1908, 40 miles north of Bakersfield, at the tail end of what I call the Black Town movement. And out of the research that I did, I've given lectures and also was the curator for a statewide traveling exhibit to celebrate Allensworth's centennial. And one of the things I learned that I hope we can talk about a little bit later is how much local history, how important local history is as part of statewide history and even national history, especially looking at the establishment of Black towns that began at a furious pace after the end of Reconstruction. A story from the time that I spent as a curator for Collecting Los Angeles at UCLA Library. I was recruited by UCLA Library Special Collections to start an initiative called Collecting Los Angeles, and the goal was to begin to document communities, ethnic, social justice, cultural communities, literary, bohemian communities that represented gaps in the collecting practice. And through that initiative, we were able to build important relationships across campus and across the community of the county of Los Angeles. What you're looking at is an image of Miriam Matthews. She was probably the first African-American librarian in the state of California. She received her degree and began working for the LA Public Library in 1927. Her papers, especially her photography collection, were legendary and known to be about close to 5,000 images documenting the African-American presence in Los Angeles starting in the 19th century. And they had sort of disappeared, especially after she passed away. When I came to UCLA Library, I was determined to find and acquire that collection, which I was able to do, of course, working with a team of people. One of the things I want to say about my time at UCLA Library Special Collections and having access to similar kinds of collections, I really learned that there's a twofold problem. That mainstream, I'm using that word a little loosely, but mainstream archives really have to change in dramatic ways and profound ways in order to sustain collecting these histories that we're talking about here today. At the same time, the other piece of that, the other side of the coin I found, where there are also so many shortcomings of community archives. And a lot of times in that world, you find people who are real advocates of community archives, and it is so-called communities that do rescue and save and tend these materials often. But there's a price to be paid, and that's something that I really think is worth discussing, how these two sides of the coin come smack up against each other. And that question of where do our records belong is really a big one that I felt that I faced in this position. Now I'm just going to move to another example and another perhaps lesson learned. In 2006, something called the California Studies Association, which began in the 80s and was really connected to the Cal State University system and really helped create the field of California studies. It used to annually give an award named after Carrie McWilliams. And in this year, the studies CSA decided to give Betty Reed Soskin the Carrie McWilliams Award. For those of you that don't know, it's easy for you to find out about her. I'll just mention she's the most famous park ranger in the United States. And she is based and helped develop the World War II Homefront National Park in Richmond, California. And I was asked by CSA, I've been on the steering committee for some time, to introduce Betty, whom I knew. I knew her and her family. I'm going to say as an aside that we just knew, our families having been around California for so long meant, almost by definition, that there were going to be connections. And I took her out to lunch. And I said, how should I introduce you? What should we talk about? And we both felt very strongly that one of the things we needed to do was talk about the Oakland, the California that she arrived in as a little girl in 1925, and the Oakland that my family arrived in and helped shape starting in the 1890s. And so that's what I did. At the gathering, I made a presentation starting in 1870, giving accounts of individuals and institutions in Oakland's early 20th century before World War I. And I concluded my talk with the story of Virginia Stevens. That's her on the left, from a photo that was published in 1915 in the NAACP's Crisis magazine. Virginia Stevens, as a 12-year-old, won the contest that had been sponsored by the San Francisco Call newspaper in 1915 to nickname the Pan-Pacific International Exposition. Her winning submission was one of 1,300, and it was the Jewel City, which is still how we refer to the PPIE. And it was a reference to the jewel-encrusted tower that was at the center of the fairgrounds. As reported in the Crisis that year, despite recognition in some local newspapers, we regret to say that when it was discovered that Miss Stevens had colored blood, there was a sudden silence on the part of the press, and the only recognition ever given her was a season ticket to the grounds. Virginia's story didn't end there. Black women's clubs organized a massive presence at the exposition, and they celebrated Virginia and her role in naming the fair. Her family was very well known in Oakland, especially in the Lake Merritt area, where her father, William, ran a restaurant for many years. He was also very active in civil rights. And she went on to the University of California, Berkeley, and got her law degree in 1929 from Bolt Hall. She was the first African-American woman in the state of California to be admitted to the bar, and she had a long career as a lawyer in the State Office of Legislative Counsel in Sacramento. And one of the things that I learned in giving this talk was, first of all, Betty and I were probably the only two people in the room who had even a sense of any of the history that I spoke about that day between 1870 and before World War I. The room was crowded with people who lived in Oakland and lived in Berkeley and had no idea, and it just drives home to me again another lesson how deeply buried local history is from the sight of people that live in the places that we're talking about. I'm going to give just a couple more examples and wrap it up. This is from my time at the California Historical Society in San Francisco. Just briefly, on the left is a handwritten deposition from 1863, a court case that was brought by Charlotte Brown against the Omnibus Streetcar Company for shoving her off the train as it did any African-American passengers it could get its hands on. She was one of, I found 6 African-Americans who sued streetcar companies who were San Franciscans in the 1860s and early 1870s. And what I want to say, and on the right is a portrait of William Shorey and his wife, Julia Shelton, and their children, Virginia and Zenobia. These are both in the collection of the California Historical Society. And what I found when I was there was that there were materials that reflected 19th century African American history, but nobody knew what they were. And some of them had been cataloged with what many of us are accustomed to, these sort of racist descriptions that we still see in collections. And I learned there what I had seen elsewhere, but here it was particularly pointed, that often like the librarians and archivists that we work with and know and love do not know what these materials are. They don't know who the people are, their history, there's no historical context. They're not bringing the context. So I worked actually very closely with the library staff and developed a public lecture that I gave several times to sold-out groups on this, revealing the hidden history of African-American, 19th century African-American San Francisco. And what I know, and I see this in several places, is once I left the California Historical Society, I'm using it as a real-life example, but I'm sure we could come up with quite a few other institutions, the knowledge of those materials left as well. So how do we institutionalize the knowledge and bring that contextual understanding? Very close to wrapping up here, and I wanted to mention another lesson that I learned when I was able to publish an article in 2020 in California History on Black politics and women's suffrage. And there were 3 campaigns for women to get the ballot in California, starting with the first one in 1896. On the left is Naomi Anderson, who stumped the state of California as a suffrage advocate. And I was able to find all kinds of wonderful coverage of her talks. And one of the most important findings of my research was how consistent and vocal and united Black men's support for women's suffrage was in California and indeed around the nation. And when I learned about the Afro-American League and its activities and its leader, Theophilus Morton, and other leaders around the state in their newspapers, like Jefferson Edwards newspaper in Los Angeles, which were enthusiastic supporters of the vote, it helped me understand, studying California, for the first time in my life, I really understood why in 1848 the women at Seneca Falls invited Frederick Douglass to speak at their convention, and then later Du Bois played a similar role in the 20th century, because they, like Theophilus Morton in California, symbolize the African American position of support for universal suffrage, enfranchisement, regardless of race, regardless of gender, which was the position of Black men and women on the whole, by and large. So that often local, what we call community history or local history, can be the door. For me, it's been the door to understanding national issues of national dimension that I just sometimes took for granted. On the right side is a picture of the 1915 meeting of the very suffragist-minded State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. That was an Oakland meeting. And just to bring us up to the present and my conclusion, I have an exhibit now at the California African American Museum, which is in Los Angeles. It's called For Race and Country, Buffalo Soldiers in California. And it goes beyond the myths about these all-Black units. It asks very difficult questions. It confronts their role in the Army's history of violence against Native Americans. It explores the historical debates in Black communities. Every war that the U.S. entered in and that African American soldiers participated in incited huge disagreements and conflicts and arguments within African American communities. And one of the things that I've learned in pulling this together is it's confirmed my interest in helping California, the practice of public history, bring California more into the national narrative and to bring the narrative of US history more into California. There's no way of understanding California, and there's no way of understanding US history without California. And this certainly reinforced that to me. I had so many people, when I was working on it, tell me, I didn't know those all-Black units were here, but they were, and they actually ended up having a very, in many cases, a permanent impact on the state, building permanent roads in national parks like Yosemite and Sequoia National Park, building towns, building churches, community halls, all that are still around and that people still use. So to conclude, as I said in my first statement, to me what's important about community history, what we call community history, isn't that it's a response to traditional narratives, but that it creates new paradigms for understanding our country, our culture, our past, our present. And one of the things I want to tell you a little story, and then I'll sit down. Usually after I give a talk that's focused on this history, I'm usually approached by, it's usually an older white man who is a retired academic. Not always, but it usually is, who asks me why didn't I talk about racism? And I tell this person, I'm not a historian of racism. I'm a historian of the African American past, and especially California's African American past. And so I look at institutions and traditions and arts and music and language and economies and politics and cultural practices. And I say that Black history and the history of racism are not the same thing. And one person that I'm thinking of in particular, I remember looking him in the eye, and the slow truth started to dawn. And what he said to me is, maybe racism is white history. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Good morning. When I was elected chair, one of the elders came up to me right away and said, whenever you talk, Val, always tell our history and always tell the truth. And I'm obligated to talk about that history every time I talk. And I'm going to give some of that now. The true history, as I said, as you heard earlier, the true history of California tribes, of the Amamutsan, has never been told. And we have been ignored, forgotten, and erased from history. We're and then when history does talk to us, does talk about the tribes, they say that people were hunters and gatherers. My gosh, you have no idea how insulting that is to us. We were not hunters and gatherers. And another thing is our history did not begin with the missions. Our history began long, long before that. Our people were here 10, 15, 20,000 years before the missions came. And if you think of that in terms of generations, 800, 900, perhaps 1,000 generations or more, that's how long our people have been here. Why isn't that history ever talked about? Why isn't that history known? Why isn't that history important? And who determines it's not important? But our creation story tells us that Creator put us here to take care of Mother Earth and all living things. That was our directive from Creator. And then Creator very clearly defined our tribe's territory and other tribes' territory. We knew not to invade our neighbor's territory. We were not warriors and fighters for territory. We did not build empires. If Creator gives you a territory, you know where you belong. And you know you're wrong to try and go to and capture your neighbor's territory and take it over. There's there's nothing ambiguous about that. So we don't understand a lot of the history that occurred here in the United States about taking over people's land, destroying their cultures, destroying their spirituality, their environments, their humanity. We do not understand that. Our people knew how to take care of the water, the fish, the winged. They knew how to take care of the oceans. They knew the most important part of all of that was maintaining sacredness, the sacredness of the lands. Wildlife, the birds, etc. They're seen that we recognize them as our relatives. We have a responsibility to take care of them as our relatives. They were created by Father Sky, our creator. They were created, and they're created and taken care of by Mother Earth, our mother. So therefore, they have the same mother and father as we do. They are our relatives. That's how we took care of them. Then came the brutal time, the horrible time of the missions, where they forcibly captured us. They sent soldiers out there with aggression, with weapons, with horses. They captured them, and the way they would capture them is to capture the women first. They would go after the women and capture them, and then they would tie them together thumb by thumb. Don't ask me why, thumb by thumb. That's a European way of thinking, I guess. And they would, once they captured all the women, they would march them back to the missions. They knew that the children would naturally follow their mothers. And they knew that it was just a very short period of time before the men would come in to be with their wives and with their families. That's how they were taken to the missions. So why do they say the Indians came to the missions voluntarily? At the missions, they were separated, men from women, from children. And they were put in their own barrack, a one-room barrack with a little pot in the corner. They locked the doors. That right there was to force assimilation and acceptance of the European way of life and Christianity. And the only way you can get your family back together is if you agree to assimilate. Why isn't that taught in our history books to our children? Why isn't the truth taught? At nighttime, the soldiers would go into the women's barracks and just rape the women time after time. You look at the mission records, and it's for the babies born. It says father unknown, father unknown, father unknown, because those children were the result of rape. That's a history, the true history of these lands that we are on. Then came the Mexican period. During that Mexican period, they gave these huge ranchos to people from Mexico to try and encourage them to come up and start populating California, because they recognized that the assimilation of California Indians wasn't working as they had hoped or wanted. And so they give these huge ranchos, and pretty soon they have ranches of 48,000 head of cattle. They need workforce for that. Who do they go to? They went to the tribes and captured the Indians and brought them back and forced them to work. At times they would pay them, but most times, it was slave labor. And if they tried to run away, they would send individuals out there to capture them. There's a story down in San Juan Bautista in 1839 where they sent an Indian tried to run away, and they lassoed him by the neck and dragged him back, and they left his body out there to put fear in other people so they would know what happened if they tried to run away. And then came the California period, the California American period. The very first State of the Union in California, the governor said that there will be a war of extermination against the California Indians. That is to be expected. Following that, one of the very first treasury bonds that was passed in the state of California was to pay for the extermination of California Indians. Why don't they teach that to the fourth graders? Why don't they teach that to the high schoolers? Why isn't that in your college American history? Perhaps now in some places it is. I sure hope so. They paid bounty monies, 25 cents to $5 bounty. And a lot of people think that just happened in the mountain locations or where the gold was at. That is not the case. In Santa Cruz, and again, we tie to Santa Cruz, there's one of those little legal notices in the paper dated 1873 that said the state of California will no longer pay bounty money for the scalps of Indians, 1873. That was 23 years after they started paying bounty money. Then they passed laws of indentured servitude, legalized kidnapping. Under the laws of legal kidnapping of Indian children, over 10,000 children were kidnapped. And usually they were sold. They were sold a lot of times just to men, because when the men came to California in search of gold, they didn't bring the women, they didn't bring wives or female companionship. And so now they're buying little girls for their female companionship, or they're buying little boys for a lifetime of hard, brutal labor. I said indentured servitude. The laws of indentured servitude of California Indians was not repealed until 1937. Indentured servitude is slavery. We had legalized Indian slavery here in California in 1837. Why isn't that taught? You know, this is history. This is our history. And it's horrendous. How are the mothers and fathers of these, how are the Indians supposed to teach their children to grow up knowing that the world is good, that they're important, that they're loved, to be optimistic, to have hope, to know tomorrow's going to be a better day, to know to know how they're supposed to, why they're here and how they're supposed to live their lives. All that has been taken away from them. And that was for 3, 4, 5 generations. Through those periods of time, our people, lived with high rates of suicide. They continue, high rates of suicide, depression, and violence, incarceration, etc. Today, we have to work to bring our people back. Our tribe holds bi-monthly wellness meetings. And those bi-monthly wellness meetings, we work to restore identity, restore our culture, restore our spirituality. And then we started dealing with hard issues of suicide, etc. At our meetings, we have a psychiatrist and 2 psychologists there. And we continue our wellness meetings. But one of the lessons that we learned in our wellness meetings is, yes, we have to recover from our historic trauma, but perpetrators must heal also. And I've written letters to the president, to the Pope, to bishops in California, to cities and counties, talking about the need to heal. Not once have I gotten a phone call back. Not once. We have to, if we're going to go forward together, if we're going to have healthy relationships, we cannot have a healthy relationship with the perpetrators not recognizing there's a problem. We must go forward with the truth. We must go forward with the people acknowledging and knowing the truth. We don't blame the people that are here in this room today. You weren't the ones that was collecting the bounty monies. You weren't the one that was paying the bounty monies. That's not you. But we ask you to recognize how much you have benefited every day from that brutal history. How much have you benefited from that history? Every morning you wake up, you put your feet in the ground. You're putting your feet on ground that was stolen. Does that mean anything? Does that mean anything? When we look at Stanford, that book, An American Genocide, by Madley, he says that the governor Stanford, he was the one that signed that treaty to pay the militias to go up there and hunt them down. And he also had his own group of militias to go out and kill Indians on the lands that he wanted for himself. And he's recognized as a very large, respected landowner, land baron. He was a damn thief. And he'd go out there and kill the Indians. He's responsible for genocide. He coveted the lands of the Indians. I'm writing a book right now, and one of the chapters I'm talking about is sin. Nobody looks at what happened to us as sin. Isn't murder a sin? Isn't stealing a sin? Isn't coveting what other people have a sin? Why doesn't the state of California, why isn't it what happened to the California Indians ever looked at in those terms? That's what we're looking for. When we look at history, we have a lot to deal with. I want us to go forward together, to find a way to go forward together. But it must be in a truthful and honest way. And it must work to help tribes restore their culture, restore their spirituality, return to their lands. And then we can talk about how do we build the future. Because that's not going to happen. If you're looking for us to assimilate and accept what we have here, I don't see how we're going to do that. Oh.
So happy to be with all of you today. Thank you so much, Al and Natalie and Josh and the other organizers. I'm so honored to be in this conversation with everyone here, including Susan and Val. It's a little hard to follow both of you. I do most of my thinking about these topics in New Haven, Connecticut, where I live, the historical homelands of Algonquin-speaking people, including the Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, and others. And in recent years, I've had more and more opportunities to teach undergrads, happily, who grew up here in the Santa Clara County. I did not think that it would make sense for me to provide too many comments in just 15 minutes, much less an in-depth analysis of Latinx or Latino history in this region, again, in just 15 minutes. I fear Al Camarillo's signs and his wrath if I go too far over time. And doing that might accidentally signal that one can actually represent the complicated history of this place in just a short amount of time, or with limited space on the page, or limited room in an archive or a museum. So I want instead to kind of cover two basic arguments that might be helpful to someone in this room, I hope, either because you agree with me or because it helps you to clarify your own types of disagreement. So first, what I want to do is highlight what I think of as roughly 4 dynamic tensions that might provide ways to conceptualize Latinx histories here and perhaps elsewhere. You'll notice as I talk that these tensions, you might think of them as themes, if you don't like tensions, are not necessarily specific to the Santa Clara County region, and that they might therefore also provide ways to connect local histories to broader national and international developments. So my first effort will be to name and say a bit about these 4 tensions or themes. One can come up with 50 others, but I just wanted to put a few on the table. And second, I'll offer a few thoughts about what I suspect are a few of the opportunities and challenges of doing local history about these communities here. And I'm going to warn you in advance that I'm not going to get this entirely right. Many of you know far more about this than I do, and your perspectives might provide a far more sophisticated and detailed analysis than I can bring in just 15 minutes to this morning's conversation. But perhaps my view will give you a few things to think about or to respond to. And I'm going to do my best to keep all this to 15 minutes. So what are the 4 major themes or tensions that I have in mind that might help us to make sense of some local Latinx histories? The first, in my view, is what I'd call the dynamic between conquest and resistance. Reckoning with Latinx history here and elsewhere, to me, requires keeping both of these in our heads as a site of tension, conquest and resistance. Beginning in the 18th century, as we've heard, colonizers from Spain and Latin America, including mestizos and Afro-mestizos, arrived to conquer and establish colonial communities here. They were violent in many ways, killing and capturing native residents, using rape as a weapon of war, and seeking to eliminate through genocide indigenous cultural practices, family structures, language, relations of exchange, and so forth. Latinos played a role as perpetuators of these violent histories, but as we also know, they were eventually themselves also victims of violent conquest, although of a different sort. From the 1840s forward, non-Latinos treated people of Mexican origin here as barriers to progress. They were racialized as non-white, sometimes disparaged as native, removed from their property, jailed as vagrants, and forced into low-wage labor after California statehood. This is a major piece of local history, as you know, and the San Jose area saw this happen here, I think, before it happened virtually any place else in the US Southwest, before Los Angeles, before southern Arizona, northern New Mexico, or South Texas, just to take a few key sites. But the tension here, of course, is also that people resisted these conquests. So anyone charged with preserving and interpreting this history must account for the ways that conquest also sparked resistance, creative accommodation, and survivance. And in turn, those responses by communities changed conquest and modes of conquest. And I think so I'm trying to name here that we need to focus on these tensions between conquest and resistance. The second of my four themes is the dynamic between what I'll call migration and place-making. Latinx history in the Santa Clara Valley region has depended on both migration and place-making. There are Latinx people in this region, of course, who can credibly claim some indigeneity, small I, deep multi-generational roots in California that trace back decades and even centuries. But just about everyone in the 20th and 21st centuries also had migrant histories. These processes had important precursors in the period of the gold rush in the 1840s and 50s when Mexicans and Chileans arrived as migrants into these parts. Political and economic disruptions in Latin America in the later 19th century and in the early 20th centuries, along with a booming agricultural economy here, prompted thousands more to pass through this region as low-wage workers in fields, orchards, canneries, and more from around 1900 through the 1950s. Many local residents valued these Latino migrants as temporary workers, and that was one of the reasons they were valued, as migrants, and appreciated the fact that they came and presumably would leave on a seasonal basis. So we need, I think, to record these migrant histories as foundational to later communities. But we need also to pay attention to the ways in which people on the move did make their homes, their places of worship, their sites of leisure in this region, as people who insisted that they would stay put. The 20th and 21st centuries are full of stories, of course, of home buying, neighborhood organizing, church building, Masonic lodges, and student takeovers. People have insisted on finding their places in this region, sometimes in the cracks between institutions, in places that were not valued by others. And they have made this region, these places, their own. And yet, of course, they've also continued to migrate in and out of this region, involved in affairs not only here in Santa Clara County, but also in Michoacan, in Tegucigalpa, in Arkansas, and many other places. So thinking here about these tensions between migration and placemaking strikes me as important, and my second theme. Third, I want to make a pitch for thinking carefully about the dynamics surrounding both politics and culture, a somewhat artificial divide, but I'll throw it out there for consideration. We can tell stories about regional history that stress that Latinos have become more powerful forces over time in both politics and culture over the last 100 years. And in general, I think that's right. There has been an ascendance in presence, politically and culturally. We can stress, of course, that politics and culture are overlapping, or perhaps even the same thing. We express our culture through our political activity, perhaps, and our cultural practices, in turn, are defined by how we experience the politics of our time. At the same time, it seems to me that we do need to be careful. Culture and politics both take many forms and have taken many forms and are easily mischaracterized individually and collectively through generalizations or just paying attention to the most prominent forms or the most prominent articulations of culture and politics. And at times, at least, people's politics and their cultural practices can go in quite different directions, even contradictory directions. Here's an example. When we think about Latino politics and culture in the 1960s and the 1970s, we often emphasize, understandably, the Chicano movement. Youth activism, calls for police accountability, anti-Vietnam War protests, and cultural nationalism. And of course, this was critical, fundamental to the period. We know this because the voices, the loud voices, who said as much that this is critical, were present. Their perspectives were received attention from the media, and some of that leadership of the period changed this region and others from the 1960s all the way into the 21st century. But we would be wrong, I think, to assume that Chicano culture and politics alone defined this period, and it'd be easy to make that mistake. It was a period, of course, that also saw To take two other examples, enthusiastic displays of patriotism and pro-Nixon sentiment in some quarters of the Latino community, and the new arrival of Mexicans and Central Americans who did not get on the Chicano train. If we miss these people in the 60s and the 70s, we don't do justice to the late 20th century. And in fact, we run the risk of failing to pay attention to the histories of an enormous percentage of today's Latino population who trace their arrival as families to the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Their founding political and cultural moment, their cultural base, was not the Chicano movement. Similarly, and I won't say much about this, any focus on Latino politics in this period and others shouldn't assume a direct causal line or an organic relationship between Latino culture and Latino politics. Even the most committed Chicano activists in the period I've discussed were living very complicated lives, of course, in which they negotiated dominant cultural practices, took their cues from various diverse communities in the region, not just fellow Mexicans, speaking English and talking about many subjects. And they had to think about negotiating the cultures of schools, of city government offices, and so much more. So let's together tell a more complicated, dynamic set of stories about the tensions between the culture and politics here and elsewhere. Finally, my fourth theme, a short but strident call that we think always about the tension between what's old and what's new in preserving and interpreting these histories I've described. It can be easy always, I think, to identify some development or some individual or group or political moment as dramatically new, transformative, revolutionary, without realizing how it fits into a longer story. At the same time, the opposite is also the case. It can be easy to always insist that nothing's new under the sun, right? That everything is continuity, that we've seen all this before in one way or another. So I think our task is to wrestle with the problems of continuity and change, to always insist that the past matters, but also to take seriously that some dramas really do have no precedent in what came before. Telling a complex story of Latinos in Santa Clara County will always require thinking through both sides of this, arguing on the one hand for continuity and on the other for dramatic change. It's a tension. In my last minute or two, let me name a few challenges as I see them to writing local histories. I'm sure I'm just scratching the surface, but hopefully not too far off. Number one is that it's difficult to preserve and interpret histories of marginalized communities just about anywhere. You all know this. Journalists didn't interview these people, at least in the right ways. Life was hard and people died young. And working class folks, of course, often did not leave as many diaries or photographs or artifacts or buildings as we would like. Second is that our local institutions have too often ignored and played an active role in the marginalization and exploitation of these communities. Most efforts that we would celebrate that are based in the region's colleges and universities, gatherings like this one, in our museums and in our historical societies and in other groups with resources are quite late to the game in trying to work in productive ways. I suspect it would be generous to say that we can trace their positive engagement with communities to the 1960s. It's probably more accurate to say that most of this work started, say, in the 1990s. Quite late. Third and finally, this region has faced a daunting set of structural problems that have made community-based history efforts that focus on Latinos quite challenging. One way to put this is capitalism. Another way to put this is myth-making, insistent myth-making, which obliterates history. I don't think I need to go into this with too much depth for this audience. You all know the problems. In the very period of the late 20th century in which local communities and professional practitioners were turning more and more attention to building counter-arguments, to creating archives, contributing to museums, teaching new and accurate curricula, and developing research projects with all this in mind. This was the same period in which local officials and developers were tearing down buildings in greater earnest. The rebranding of the region as Silicon Valley called for a rush into the future, and it probably dignified all of the celebratory and ahistorical and often racist rhetoric about a white pioneering spirit and a shared goal of economic progress that boosters wanted to share and celebrate in this area. So in the face of all this, it's not, of course, been easy to save, to recover, to share, and to think hard about Latinx populations or many other populations in this area. This is, of course, not only a problem here, but it might be worse in this county than in almost any other part of the United States. So in the face of all this especially, I'm grateful for all of you, to all of you, for working so hard and with so much wisdom. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn this back to Al, who will now, of course, offer solutions to everything I've suggested.
Thank you, Steve, Val, and Susan. So I'm going to invite you all up here to sit the front. So we have about 15, this session's supposed to end at 10:30. So we have about 15 minutes to field any questions you may have. We have some microphones up here, so we won't have to come to the podium. And you're welcome to pose questions. If it's to one of the individuals, please identify if it's a question that you'd like the panel to kind of consider together, and we can divvy up who responds. So please, questions from the audience. And Natalie and Josh are circulating with microphones. Yes, please.
Good morning, and thank you all for the knowledge that you're coming to share today with us. My question, maybe for Valentin and Stephen, it relates to cultures that lean heavily on orality. Considering that, traditional ways to collect histories usually are, in the written form, but particularly, coming from a Latino culture, I know that orality is really important, and, history is passed, down to the newer generations through the spoken word. So I'm not sure if you want to, elaborate a little bit how those histories can be also collected.
Thank you for the question. Such an important question. The focus. I'll answer a piece of this, and then I know Val will give a better answer than I can provide. What I think about when I think about the question of orality is the challenge of rethinking how what we value in history and how we do history at all. Of course, some of this just comes down to what some people talk about as kind of standards of evidence, what it kind of takes to prove a point, who we believe, what we require in order to present something as true. And I think, recording, telling the stories of the kinds of communities that I work on, of course requires, doing the work in archives and written sources, archaeological sources, and so forth. But it does also demand a real engagement with living people and the stories that they've told. That sometimes means trying to get things that one might think of as data or facts, like what would actually happen, what was your experience with this or that? When did your family arrive? Where did you work? This kind of data collection. But it also requires thinking through in hard and challenging ways. The presentation of stories as also forms of knowledge, right? As things that are not necessarily data driven, but are actually, ethically driven. Capsules that try to tell stories that somehow embody community connections or community priorities. This is something that I think challenges, traditional practitioners in all sorts of fields. We know this, but if we're not doing that, if we're not pushing those boundaries, we're not going to ever get to the stories that we need to get to, because the archive is all too often a kind of one-sided colonial construct. It tells a story, it doesn't tell the stories that we want to tell in the present day. So it's a challenge, I think, methodologically, but one that I think we have to embrace as we do this work in the 21st century. Val?
This is a hard question for Native Americans, because those those 3 periods of colonization, I said that they wanted to destroy our indigenous knowledge. And they were almost succeeded completely. You know, we forgot a lot of our songs. We forgot a lot of our places of power. We forgot a lot of our traditions and ways. And today our tribe is working hard to restore that knowledge. And the way we're restoring it, we basically have a four-step approach to that. We talk to our elders, try to collect as much information as we could, and we document that. We talk to our neighboring tribes about what knowledge that they retain and how can we share that knowledge with each other. A good example of that is our knowledge of how to steward the coastline and oceans. Right now we work with other tribes throughout California, on putting all the little pieces together to restore that knowledge of how to steward the oceans and coastlines. The third way is through archaeology. I mean, I used to hate archaeologists, but it can be used in a good way to help us restore that knowledge and tell us what was here before. A good example of that was, what did this landscape look like before first contact? And now we want to restore those landscapes back to that. And then the fourth way for our tribe is we have our last traditional leader was Ascension Solorzano. She was born in 1855, and at age 6 she had a near-death experience. And in that near-death experience, she was recognized as a healer. And her formal training as a healer started at age 11 at Pinnacles National Park, at that territory there. She studied on how to be a healer, but she also was recognized as a leader. So she had to learn our culture, our traditions, our stories, etc. And she contracted cancer in 1929, and she went home to die. And then there's a knock on the door. And she had a vision about this just before the turn of the century. There was a knock on the door, and she opened the door, and there was a little, thin, skinny man, very small, and he had his hat in his hand, and he had a suit on. His name was J.P. Harrington, who had a PhD from Stanford University in linguistics, by the way. There is a tie here. J.P. Harrington, and he was sent out by the Smithsonian to capture the stories of the elders who were quickly dying. And together they wrote over, between 28 and 78,000 pages of anthropological field notes. And that's how we are going to be able to restore 90 to 95% of our indigenous knowledge. And our knowledge, that our stories they're all oral histories and such like that. So it's very hard to capture. Even our birth certificates. If someone dies at childbirth and there is no birth certificate, no record of a marriage there, I mean, it's how do you get that link? We don't. So that's kind of the best answer I can give to that.
Susan, do you want to weigh in on this question of sources?
Yes. What I would like to say, I think all of us are both practitioners and researchers. And I have found one of the most frustrating things in the world is, as a researcher, finding oral histories that have been conducted by the community that are really so poorly done, so far from the standards that we need for the oral history to be useful to speak to us, that I find that that's an issue. And I know that there is a workshop coming up about oral history that Natalie's leading, and I think it's really important. I mean, there really is a gold standard for conducting oral histories. And one of the big issues I've seen in my experience around the state of California, I'll leave it at that, is that community-based documentation efforts do not have access to the training that is required to conduct worthwhile oral histories. And oral history is itself an artifact. And oral history requires art and science and knowledge. So, somebody has to give up on, this is what I was saying before about this tension between, so-called mainstream collections and archives and community-based documentation efforts. Somebody's going to have to start telling the truth, about where we need to bridge the gap, where the issues are, why do community efforts, why don't they deserve the access to the best resources? So that's my take on it. I'm lucky. I was trained by a wonderful, the director of the Center for Oral History Research at UCLA, Teresa Barnett, and I conducted oral histories, and and there's a gap there. These programs don't make themselves accessible to the community, and community people just keep recording these interviews that end up being useless.
Thank you for putting this panel together. As we all know, California has recently started the effort of requiring ethnic studies as part of the high school graduation. And I'm glad the 3 pillars are being represented here, which is Latinx, the Black community, and the Native American. And let's not forget the Asian Americans in that mix. Especially here in Stanford, where we just hear in the working tour that Stanford wouldn't be here if it hadn't been the Chinese laborers. One of the things I think is very important to talk about is, as ethnic studies being taught in schools, the kids need to understand the relevancy of it and the context of it. And I think that's where the community historians comes into play, because they can make field trip, they can understand things, they can see places where these things make relevance. I'm just curious, in terms of your own historical background and leaders in the community, how are you bringing the schools to the relevancy of your history that contributed to American history?
I think I can answer that question, because I've been involved in all of this for the last many years. So your point is really well taken, because if you look at the framework that the State Board of Education adopted for the ethnic studies curriculum, it's called the Ethnic Studies Curricular Framework, for all schools throughout the state of California. So those that you may not know, last October, Governor Newsom signed the law mandating an ethnic studies semester course beginning 2025 for every California high school student. And by 2029, they must have that course as a part of their curriculum to graduate. But very importantly, to your question, that ethnic studies model framework tells teachers and schools that here's the framework for teaching about the various groups, but you need to utilize your local community resources to bring it alive. And I think that will give an exciting possibilities for teachers to engage local communities, right? Whether it be the historical societies or some organization, or have conversations with elders from various communities come into these classrooms to bring some of that history alive. So there's enormous potential for that, and I hope that as this curriculum evolves, there's more of that is considered, so it becomes institutionalized as a part of the ethnic studies curriculum.
It's for Val. Based on what you said about the history, the bloody history and the sins of Stanford, what do you think about the fact that Stanford begins most of its events now with the land acknowledgement?
No, that's nice, but pretty soon, after you hear it a couple of times, it's just words, and and how do you make it meaningful? I'm not too impressed with that. I do want to say I am Tomian. I do come from this is traditionally the Tomian territory, and I do have ancestry to the Tomian territory. So that's one thing I wanted to say today.
Thank you.
Okay, well, it's time to bring this to end. Please join me in thanking our panelists.